Ah, yes, the new era. That thing that Jeff seems to love. As for everyone else, well, it's a bit more complicated. Now that we're 4 seasons deep, everyone and their mom seems to have an opinion of the new era. And while the show consistently does well in its time slot in the ratings, some think the show has gone too far. Some have even stopped watching altogether. In this video, I want to take a broader look at this issue. Is the new era good? Is Survivor broken beyond repair? And what can we expect from the future? Well, let's dive in. So basically how I'm going to be breaking this down is I'm going to be going through a list of many of the features and issues that I've seen pop up regarding the new era. And sort of like my season reviews, I wanted to break them down by category, going from the cast to the production to the gameplay. So first up we have the casting, which has changed quite a bit in recent years. Now, even before the new era, changes were starting to be made, such as bringing on Jesse Tannenbaum as the casting director, as well as opening up applications to Canadian players. But really, the new era is where we really got to see a lot of these changes come into full force. And while some of these changes are good, plenty of others have their controversies. So I wanted to go through some of these points and give my thoughts on them. So first up, probably the biggest change to come during the year-and-a-half break leading up to 41 was the introduction of the diversity mandate. Now, obviously, this applies to Big Brother as well, and I think for the most part, it's worked out pretty well, where every season has had at least one person of color reach Final Tribal, with 3 winners between them, with Erica, Marianne, and Jam Jam. I feel like on the whole, it's pretty net positive, don't have too many complaints there. Next up, we have the introduction of Canadian players, and similar to the diversity mandate, I also feel like this has worked out pretty well, where even though Tom Laidlaw was a bit of a dud, I feel like in the new era, we have gotten pretty successful Canadian players. Again, Erica and Marianne are both Canadian. We've also had the likes of Omer, Drea, and Kane all make relatively deep runs across their seasons. So again, I don't have too many complaints about the introduction of Canadian players. But now we get to some of the more controversial aspects of the casting process and the people that have played Survivor in the new era. Where first up, people have talked about how there are too many sob stories in the new era. I mean, you had the likes of Jesse, who grew up like in a rough background, went to juvie, and then ended up turning his life around. You have Noelle, someone that lost her leg, but then proved to be an inspiration. You have people like Mariah, who lost her brother due to COVID and had to cope with that. You have all these instances of players that come in and get to share about how exceptional their lives are. And I find myself kind of agreeing with this, where it sort of reminds me of other reality shows like America's Got Talent, where it seems like everyone comes on and they have this big sob story about how their mom died and how like they are going through a lot in their lives and that they're going on the show to really grow and to change and to prove to the world that they are worth something, which obviously I'm not a huge fan of, and I don't like that Survivor is leaning more into that direction. However, I will also admit that it was probably a byproduct of the new era, where it had come back from a long break and there was a lot of reflection during that break, and that led to a lot of people just feeling like this was their one opportunity, that this was somehow more sacred than it probably would have been otherwise. And I feel like the show is starting to tone down on this now that we are getting more comfortable in the new era, that we saw in 44 that season had a more comical tone than anything else. So I feel like as the new era progresses that we are going to see less of this to where it'll probably be less of a problem, but it was still something worth highlighting. Another thing I've heard quite a bit in online discussion is that Survivor is casting too many superfans, that these people are too game body and that they want a return to the messiness and bitterness that we saw in Gabon and Nicaragua and some of these other seasons, and I simply don't agree with that. I mean, I'm someone that values gameplay first, and I don't really see the issue of casting people that love and understand the game. I mean, yes, while Gabon and Nicaragua can be enjoyable from time to time, I don't want every season to be like that. I feel like casting superfans is generally a more reliable strategy for evolving the game than casting people that don't know what they're doing. And I think Big Brother Canada is a great example of that, where they have been leaning more into people that don't understand the game as much, which can lead to messy gameplay, as we saw on BB Can 9 and BB Can 10, but then we got to BB Can 11 where it felt more frustrating than anything else, where we saw these players have these clear opportunities in front of them and they are just not taking them for whatever reason. I think a lot of this stems from the notion that there's this inverse relationship between good gameplay and entertainment, which I simply don't think is the case. I mean, I can see where it comes from, where you would think that messy gameplay is more unpredictable, when really I think it's more of a coin toss over whether casting people that you would think would play messy are actually going to do it in an entertaining way. I feel like at the end of the day, I would rather see the gameplay evolve than to have it stagnate. And through that, I feel like the superfan thing just isn't that much of an issue for me. Now, that's not to say that superfans can't make for boring TV from time to time, but I would still rather have people that understand the game than people that don't. Another issue I've heard with New Era casting is that they're casting too many white collar workers, sort of the opposite of Worlds Apart, where they're leaning way more into the Carolyns and Joaquins of the world, and less so the Mikes and the Rodneys. And I actually agree with this. I mean, as a white collar worker myself, I feel like the show is really lagging on this socioeconomic diversity. Now, admittedly, it's not a massive problem in the grand scheme of things. I feel like there are plenty of other issues with the New Era in general that we'll be getting more into in a moment, but I feel like the casting of mostly white collar workers does simplify the social game by giving people more common ground to work with, and in general, that's not the most interesting gameplay. Now, you could say that some of this is outside the show's control, given that, well, there may not be as many blue collar people to cast in the first place, but considering that the show has historically been more diverse on this front, and particularly with a 39-day season versus a 26-day season that we have now, I feel like they could definitely do better on this front if they really wanted to. But really, I think these last couple points tie into what is probably the biggest issue that people have with New Era casting. It's that there's just not enough normal people on Survivor anymore. It seems like everyone they cast has some exceptional backstory, that they've accomplished some wonderful things that most normal people wouldn't. And I feel like I generally agree with this sentiment, where it can definitely become a bit much when every single person has accomplished some great thing or what have you. So I feel like the show could definitely benefit from casting other types of people aside from their story, basically. But with that said, I can also kind of see why they would cast those type of people, given that they have interesting stories to tell and they can generally make for better TV. Whereas I feel like casting more normal people could make the show more boring to watch. And I feel like Roxroy is a great example of this, sort of casting a regular old guy, someone that wasn't really good at the game, and I feel like they weren't really much of a character either. So I feel like there's definitely a balance to be reached, but at the end of the day, I can definitely see where people are coming from. So obviously, there's plenty to be said about the casting in the New Era of Survivor. However, let's move on to production, which is probably where I and a lot of other people have the most complaints. Where first up, you have 26 days. 39 days was iconic. 26 days is just too short. There's not enough time to build bonds with people. It's just not Survivor. And I think this is another issue that I'm kind of on the fence about, where on one hand, I feel like a lot of those concerns that people bring up are just not as significant for me, where I feel like 26 days is still a decent amount of time to get to know someone. And plus, with so many people being focused on the game, I feel like 26 days still gives us plenty of time to have interesting gameplay, and I feel like there are far bigger issues that impact the gameplay in the New Era than just the fact that it's 26 days. Now, where I do take some issue with 26 days is the concern that there may not be enough footage to be gathered, given there just isn't as much time, which can make it tougher for the show to explain what's happening and to have the footage to outline all the dynamics within the game. And now that they're switching to 90-minute episodes, I do question how well they're going to be able to use that time, whether they're going to be able to actually explain what's happening and to outline what we want to see with longer episodes, or whether they're just going to waste that time on nonsense. But at the end of the day, I don't mind 26 days as much as other people. I mean, yes, I prefer it to be 39 days, but I think if we're considering the show's longevity in terms of cutting production costs and attracting applicants that otherwise wouldn't have the time to play, I think 26 days is a fine enough trade-off, but obviously I would prefer it to be 39 days. But now we move on to what I consider probably the most fundamental issue with the New Era in terms of production, and that's the 3-tribe, no swap format in the pre-merge. And I thought it was okay at the time they introduced it. I felt like it was fine for 41 and 42, where players came in and were playing their games as if there was a swap coming, only for the twist to be, there is no swap. So I thought that was interesting for a bit, but really it should have stopped after 42. And really, I think the fact that they're doubling down on this really makes a lot of these seasons feel the same. And in general, I think it really harms the gameplay in the pre-merge, which I'll be talking about more in a moment. But a lot of it stems from Jeff having this misguided idea that smaller tribes leads to less wiggle room, and less wiggle room leads to more interesting gameplay, where on paper, one person can completely change the vote. When in reality, we have seen that it leads to more groupthink, where it's just easier to latch onto one specific target and just go along with it, as if anyone disagrees, then there's a higher probability that the alternative will be themselves. So we've seen these lopsided votes play out. And when you add in all these other factors, like the fact that there's no swaps, the fact that there's these twists that take away people's votes, I think it just makes this problem even worse, and it gives the minority even less opportunity to turn things around, which is exactly the opposite of what you want. And considering they've used this format now on all 4 of the New Era seasons so far, and 45 and 46 seem to be doubling down on it, it just makes the pre-merge feel the same more often than not, which is pretty boring. So I really don't think the format works well in the New Era, so I think they really need to change it up. Next up, we have the Earn the Merge twist, which I'm not a big fan of, obviously. I'm pretty annoyed that Jeff is insisting on these semantics where it's like, oh, you're merged, but you're not quite, when really, I think they are. I feel like I always treat like the mergatory round as the merge round. I treat the people voted out in those rounds as the merge boots, and still I worry that it leads to people getting screwed over in certain instances. I mean, the Hourglass was a pretty notable instance of that, with Sydney and Lydia getting screwed over, but at the end of the day, I'm just kind of whatever on it. I mean, I would rather have a regular merge round and not make that big of a deal out of it. But if you want to have a challenge to break up the first half and the second half of the season and to play some word games to make it seem like it's not the merge, sure, whatever. As long as you're upfront about it and don't have some stupid hourglass to get in the way, go right ahead. Next up, we have the new twists that they brought in, and I've said this before, but I'm kind of mixed on these twists, where some of them are good, some of them are pretty bad. I mean, you're not going to hear me talk about how do or die was a good idea, but I also think some of them have worked out pretty well, such as the Shot in the Dark, the Choose Your Champion twist from 43, even the Amulets from 42. While they didn't quite live up to their potential, I think they're at least a cool concept. And while I have bashed on Jeff before for not listening to the fans, he does listen sometimes, particularly when it comes to how bad the Hourglass and Do or Die were. And while I wish he would generally slow down with introducing new twists, or at least letting some of them sit for more than one season, I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like the fact that he's at least willing to innovate is at least a good intention. So to that end, I'm sort of mixed on the twists. And finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the after show and the fact that they aren't having live reunions, which Jeff did bring up during his podcast, where he claims that he likes the raw emotions and players feeling proud of their games. While they have a live reunion, then it causes players to defend their games because they saw the show and the people's reactions to them. And I feel like this is a mostly inoffensive aspect of the New Era, but I really would prefer a live reunion. And I think, to Jeff's point, I think we could definitely have a compromise where they could tape an after show that captures the raw emotions, and to have a backup in case something cancels the reunion in the future, but then you still have the live reunion afterwards where you can show clips from the after show and then post the whole thing online afterwards. I think there's definitely a middle ground to be reached here, so to that end, I feel like this is definitely something that the New Era could bring back in the future. So obviously there's plenty to be said about the state of casting and production, but ultimately, how does it impact the gameplay, which I said was the most important thing for me. Well, it's still Survivor, of course, but there's obviously some trends that have emerged in the New Era that I don't really like. First up, you have the pre-merges, which I already talked about with the format. Again, they're just pretty boring. I feel like they lead to pretty straightforward votes, and plus, the small tribes pretty much discourage Shot in the Dark plays, as players believe that their vote makes all the difference. And while 44 did show some promise with the return of regular idols that can open up the game to more shakeups, I still think this problem needs to be addressed more, and I think 45 and 46 need to do more to shake up the format. Next up is something that has definitely come into the forefront since 43 and was only reinforced in 44, but it's the fact that this pre-merge format seems to heavily disfavor women, which reinforces the idea that challenge strength is important in the pre-merge, and that since women are perceived to be weaker in challenges than men, that leads to more women being voted out in the pre-merge. And I mostly agree with this. Now, obviously Survivor has had plenty of gender issues even before the New Era, and it seemed like things were turning around with 41 and 42, where we obviously saw that women were not being voted out as much. Although you could say that was because players were not aware about the no swaps thing. So that meant that 43 and 44 were the real test of the format, where the players knew that there weren't going to be any swaps coming in. And the result was that almost every vote out in the pre-merge across 43 and 44 were women. Now, obviously you could say that a lot of these women were taken out for strategic reasons, or in weird situations where a man would have been taken out otherwise. I mean, just look at the Maddie and Sarah votes. But there are also plenty of votes where you can say that the vote was partially or primarily driven by challenge strength, such as the NECA vote from 43 or the Claire vote from 44. I feel like any way you slice it, the optics are terrible. Now obviously 45 and 46 are coming out soon, so it'll be interesting to see what happens here, whether this trend will continue or if it'll lead to some backlash where maybe we'll see a women's alliance emerge to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But for the time being, I think it's pretty clear that the new era does not look good in this department. As for the post-merge, I think it has largely held strong. I feel like on each of the new era seasons, the post-merge has been better than the pre-merge. However, the twists still kind of get in the way, where on 41 and 42 we saw pretty crucial rounds being taken away due to twists, where the Final 9 was taken away by the Split Tribal, and the Final 7 was taken away by Do or Die. 43 did do away with Do or Die, which gave us a normal Final 7 round, but we still had the Split Tribal taking away the Final 9, and then on 44 you had that really bad Split Tribal that happened right after the Earn the Merge twist, where you literally only had 5 people participating in the tribal and even only 5 people participating in the scramble, which felt really bad. It really shook at the pacing of the season. However, from the final 10 on, the rest of the game played out normally, and I know it's crazy, but the fact that we got normal Survivor for a decent chunk of the season was pretty refreshing. So there are definitely signs of improvement as the new era is smoothing itself over. However, at the end of the day, I still feel like these twists can really hamper things up, so I really wish they would go back to having more normal Survivor, which sounds like a lot these days, but hey, one can only ask. And finally, a point that gets brought up quite a bit is that the best player doesn't usually win in the new era, that winners tend to be pretty mid, which obviously is not new to the new era. We've had plenty of mediocre winners in Survivor history, and I don't think it's something that can be fixed by production, and probably shouldn't either. I mean, history has shown that the pendulum shifts over time in light of what's happened before. Whenever you have a string of dominant winners, that's usually followed by that style of gameplay being targeted earlier on, which leads to under the radar winners. And then under the radar winners tend to do well for a bit until that style of gameplay gets picked up. And through that allows a more dominant player to emerge as they can sort of take advantage of the fact that there are other targets ahead of them. And I think that's part of the beauty of Survivor, that Survivor is very much defined by the people who play it. And I'm glad that we have seen so many different ways that people have won Survivor. And while we have seen in 41, 42, and 43 that the winners were more under the radar, we literally saw in 44 that the winner was a bit more dominant. So that alone is a testament to the way that Survivor grows and evolves over time, that we don't need production in order to make things interesting, that the players can do it for themselves. And it also shows that this issue of under the radar winners is less so an issue of the new era itself, and more so how players are reacting to what they've seen before. And once they've seen enough of the same thing, that encourages them to take on a new style and to reward a new way of playing. So ultimately, I don't think that's really much of an issue for me. So now that we've gone through a lot of the main issues with the new era, I think it begs the question, is the new era good? Well, there are definitely a lot of issues with it, and a lot of the experimentation has not gone according to plan, and I think probably the most fundamental issue of all this is that the new era is one of clashing philosophies. I feel like some of this can be chalked up to the fact that it's based on experimentation, but I feel like a lot of the ideas present contradict each other. Like the show insists on casting superfans and people that can and will shake things up, but then they throw in these twists that can at times dictate the game for them. They're casting people that can play the game, only to have the game play them. And despite Jeff constantly throwing all these new ideas onto the show, introducing these new twists and ideas, when you watch each of the seasons, they all kind of feel the same. They all follow the same pace of a slow pre-merge, a slow-ish early merge, and a pretty interesting post-merge where we have big threats being taken out, but really, a lot of that just kind of feels repetitive and makes each season feel less memorable. And while Jeff has shown some willingness to change ideas based on fan reaction to them, he has also doubled down on less than desirable things, such as the 3 tribes and no swaps and the earn the merge twist. So I think Survivor finds itself in an interesting spot at this point, where on one hand, there are definitely plenty of issues with it and plenty of things that I wish it would change, but at the same time, it is still the show that I love. It is still Survivor, and it is still a show that I will tune into in the fall. So at the end of the day, I still like Survivor. It's a show that I care about a lot, but one that needs to be fixed. So there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Now obviously I'll continue to make content in the future, so stay tuned for that. Big Brother 25 is starting up relatively soon, so you can expect coverage of that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.